Hello, everyone, again. And following our deep dive into the rise of China and the threat it poses to India in particular and the world in general, we are privileged to have Foreign Secretary Harsh Shringla with us. Please give him a very warm round of applause. We are hoping he will tell us on how he is guiding India's foreign policy in this volatile world that's there. Not just the challenges we face against an aggressive China, but also the other big issues. The new world order emerging in the midst of the worst pandemic that humanity has seen in recent times. The major power blocks and alignments that are emerging. The Afghanistan crisis, which we briefly touched in the previous discussion. Dealing with a hostile and emboldened Pakistan after their coup in Afghanistan. Apart from other nations in our neighborhood and the challenges posed by the other big issue that the world faces and has to deal with, climate change. So that's a whole lot of issues that's there, Harsh Shringla. And may I begin by asking you, firstly, to begin with, I mean, all these dramatic changes that we have witnessed in the world and in our region, how would you describe these and define them? And how is India navigating through this very troubled world that is there, particularly on our foreign policy? Please go ahead, Mr.
Well, thank you, Raj, for the introduction, for having me on the India Today Conclave. It is a volatile world out there. The world has seen the greatest shock to the international system since the Second World War. COVID-19 has claimed millions of lives and destroyed hundreds of millions of livelihoods. We are still in the midst of this, not knowing where exactly this will go. In addition, we've seen a sort of a geopolitical shift. The images of the fall of the Berlin Wall are fast fading. Unipolarity is giving way to a multipolarity of sorts. We've also seen an increasing level of economic output and dynamism in Asia, with India an integral part of that process. That is leading to a redistribution of the global GDP towards Asia. Politically, economically, in technological terms, capacities are shifting to Asia in a rebalance. And in some senses, this is changing the power equation. And when you have, I think those of us who are students of international relations would know that when you have a situation in which the balance of forces shifts, it has its consequences. And those consequences also result, in many cases, in friction. And we have seen instances of friction as a result. Friction doesn't necessarily have to mean friction in military terms, but economic friction, trade wars, greater volatility in the global scenario. Now, where does Indian foreign policy fit into all of this, and how do we deal with this?
And have you realigned your foreign policy to meet with this?
Well, foreign policy in general represents continuity and change. Continuity are those elements that, well, in some senses represent your core values and interests, which don't change very much. Geographies, destinies, so your neighbors remain the same. But you do need to have a foreign policy that is nimble and agile in dealing with the changes that the international order brings. And many of these changes are not those that you had any ability to either predict or to, in some senses, influence. COVID-19, of course, is a case in point. But you do need to be involved in minimizing the consequences on your own domestic environment. One very important and immediate case in point is the situation in Afghanistan.
Yep.
Now, the US decision to withdraw from Afghanistan was not something that we had a hand in. After 20 years of investing blood and treasure in that country, the US decided for its own reasons to pull out of Afghanistan. But the consequences are those that we've had to obviously face. We're an immediate neighbor, and we have very high stakes in the way Afghanistan develops, the regional situation evolves around it, and its impact on everything that is important to us. And from that perspective, I think our diplomacy has been very, very engaged on that issue. Since, I would say, 15th of August, when the Taliban took over Kabul, we have been involved in a series of very high-level diplomatic engagements. The Prime Minister has spoken to a number of heads of state and government. You know that he recently met President Biden, he met President Suga, Prime Minister Suga and Scott Morrison. But he's also spoken to President Putin, who sent a high-level team down to India to engage us on the Afghanistan issue. He's had conversations with President Macron. He's also spoken to many of the other leaders that are involved with the situation. Foreign Minister has met the new President of Iran. He's met the heads of state and government of most Central Asian states. I would say that we have been in contact with practically everyone who matters on this situation.
If I can just intervene at this moment, I mean, one of the things, yesterday when Dr. Abdullah was talking to me, we had a session with him, the former CEO of Afghanistan. He said that it is his advice to India was that India should engage with the new government. There's a clear and present danger for us in terms of the security issues that the Taliban regime throws up in terms of the jihadi groups. So he says to engage with them on that and to provide humanitarian assistance, even if we don't want to proceed with recognizing the government at some point. So what is, have we engaged with the Taliban regime? And what is, what is the movement forward? Do you think Dr. Abdullah's advice is something worth looking at?
Well, nimbleness and suppleness in diplomacy also means that you have to reach out to all those that you have to deal with, irrespective of what they represent. This dispensation is in power, and we have engaged them. We have had our ambassador in Doha, Qatar, deal with their delegation there at senior levels. We've got some reassurances and some sense of how they would like to see our involvement. I think they were quite positive in terms of our continued engagement on the development front, on retaining our diplomatic presence. But what is important also is that we need to watch carefully how the situation on the ground unfolds. After all, we were involved in the UN Security Council when Resolution 2593 was adopted. India was the president of the council. We steered the negotiations towards a conclusion that really, in many senses, is seminal in determining the international community's approach towards Afghanistan. And that resolution calls for an inclusive, negotiated political settlement. It calls for the human rights of women, children, and minorities. It calls for humanitarian access, direct humanitarian access to the international community. It also demands that Afghanistan does not in any way use its territory to the detriment of others in terms of terrorism. So these are very important factors in how we deal with Afghanistan. And in that context, I think we have to really see how that evolves. I mean, we have seen the formation of a government that is far from inclusive or representative. You've seen the DG of the ISI go there and facilitate a government that has 35 members of the cabinet who are designated individuals in the UN Security Council's list. So that's not a great start. And I think we have to carefully watch how the situation, as I said, develops. The international community has significant leverages. We've got frozen assets, which are in bank accounts abroad. You've got the entire development partnership paradigm, which is there. Afghanistan does depend on external resources to a great extent. But as far as humanitarian assistance is concerned, I think we, like many other members of the international community, have said that we separate what is in the welfare of the people of Afghanistan from the actions of the present dispensation in power. In other words, we are more than willing to provide humanitarian assistance. You have to remember that India has been a constructive player in Afghanistan. Over the last 20 years, we have invested over $3 billion in Afghanistan's development directly. We are the only country that has development projects in every of the 34 provinces of Afghanistan. So we are happy to continue the humanitarian assistance part.
And that is what I think Afghanistan representative asked India recently, humanitarian to start with.
Unhindered, unimpeded, direct humanitarian assistance to be distributed through the UN and other civil society organizations is what we've asked for. We've delivered 1 million tons of wheat to Afghanistan over the last 15, 20 years. We're happy to do much more in helping the people of Afghanistan. But the conditions have to be appropriate.
Sure. You've set the benchmarks in the UN resolution, and those are the things India look for. But I want to come to what you had mentioned, the concerns that India has of the role that Pakistan is playing in Afghanistan, the fact that the ISI chief went there, the fact that the Haqqani network seems to dominate the current regime's government on this matter. How serious is that problem for us? What is the role you see Pakistan playing over there? What are the dangers for India?
Well, when you support and nurture an ideology that is associated with acts of terrorism, extremism, radicalism, you have to be careful that it doesn't come back and it's not counterproductive. And what we are really looking for is responsible actions by those who are able to control the situation in Afghanistan. So whether it is Pakistan or whether it is the Taliban, we expect that there would be actions that are responsible and that in many senses the commitments they've made to the international community, which were conveyed fairly early on in the game, are lived up to. And those commitments are benchmarks, as you mentioned, that I think we, as well as most members of the international community, expect to hold them to. I think that is very important. Obviously, we would like to do everything possible to ensure that this does not impact adversely on us. We are already seeing some impact of some of this situation. Whether there is a direct linkage or not, we are not sure. But there are concerns out there, and we have to be able to use our instruments of diplomacy, or every instrument available to us, to ensure that we are insulated from the impact of such outcomes that could be detrimental to our interests.
Now, you mentioned that you are noticing some problems that are coming up post the Afghanistan takeover by Taliban. We have seen in Srinagar 2 days ago the shooting of innocent teachers, and there's a communal angle to it. We've seen the ceasefire somewhat break down in Pakistan, that it's sort of this thing. How do we proceed with Pakistan? You see the situation worsening. What is it that you expect of Pakistan now? We are not in, I mean, we have our embassies still operating there, but what is the way forward? What do we expect from Pakistan?
Well, we've always maintained that we want good relations with all of our neighbors, including Pakistan. But it is incumbent on Pakistan to ensure that there is no attempt or no direct impact of cross-border terrorism on India from any of its territories. And that, I think, is, again, something that we would hold them to. And until and unless that, let's say, commitment or that requirement from our side is fulfilled, we certainly would have serious issues. And if there is continuing impact of cross-border terrorism, that would also have its own impact.
And do you see these recent incidents that are there, the growing hostility in some senses? Is there a connection?
Well, look, for one, we have had a ceasefire agreement, and that has held to a large extent. There are some violations, but that is there. We've seen increasing infiltration, including the involvement of terrorists from across the border. You've seen on television that one of the terrorists was captured, and he was, I think, he's a direct evidence of the involvement of terrorist organizations within Pakistan. That is putting it as minimally as possible. But, again, the fact of the matter is that these are areas that are very important in terms of how our relationship develops. And unless the basic core issue of terrorism emanating from Pakistan and its territories is dealt with, I think we will not see much forward movement in that relationship.
How do we see the threat coming from Afghanistan, given the fact that all these groups all the groups inimical to our interests have deep connections with the Taliban regime? Are we gearing up our internal security to meet that threat? How confident are we, or what else do we need to do?
Well, the concern really is that whether you have spaces within Afghanistan that can be used by terrorist groups. Various countries have various terrorist groups that are of concern. Terrorism in general is of concern. Whether those who control Afghanistan's territory can actually control the groups that operate out of it is something that we have to see. But I don't think we can take it in good faith, and I think we have to be prepared to deal with contingencies that arise out of a more volatile Afghanistan, a situation that is going to be exacerbated by the humanitarian crisis that we will experience or are experiencing, a lack of governance that is there. And I think in many senses, a possibility that those, again, interests that could be wanting to use the situation to the detriment of others would, I would say, take advantage is something that we have to be fully prepared for. So I would say that our, whether it's our diplomacy, it's our political posture, whether it is our security forces, I think we need to be completely on the same page that this is a threat that could be potentially serious, and we need to be able to be fully prepared to meet that threat. And I would say, going by all the, I would say, activity in terms of interministerials, in terms of the interagency coordination that we are witnessing, I think the system is fully geared up to meet that challenge.
Let's move to China now, and there are several dimensions and problems that arise out of that. And let's start with the military dimension. We've had the aggression in the Galwan Valley and others. We've seen some sort of pushback from China in the last month because of the resistance we put up on this and this thing. Where do we stand on the military or the aggressive intent that China has on the border? Do you see an end to it? Where have we reached in that confrontation, if you'd like to call it?
Well, one of the, we did talk about a volatile world and the COVID situation. We were, I would say, very preoccupied with dealing with the first wave of the COVID crisis. We found that a sort of a huge buildup of Chinese forces along the border areas in our western sector in Ladakh, in our eastern sector in Ladakh, what we call Western Ladakh. And also attempts at multiple translations at various points, which are in clearly, I mean, both the amassing of troops and the attempts at translations are in violation of several agreements that we have signed, in particular agreements in 1993 and 1996. And those issues, I think, have in many senses strengthened our resolve that unless these issues are dealt with firmly and we get full satisfaction out of the situation, we will not be able to go back to a restoration of normal ties with China. The entire agreement of 1988, based on which the two countries agreed to take forward this relationship, and I think we've done quite well over the last 4 decades or so in the way that the bilateral exchanges have progressed, with trade close to $90 billion, several exchanges at all levels. But all of this was contingent on peace and tranquility in the border areas. And here is where we have a serious issue. Now, we've had 12 rounds of senior commanders meetings on the ground. We've had several rounds of the working mechanism at the diplomatic levels. We have resolved some of the issues that were most, I would say, pressing along the border areas. But we are still, I think, in that process. We would have a 13th round quite soon. We hope that we can make headway. But we still do maintain that until we get full satisfaction that the situation that has arisen as a result of Chinese assertiveness and aggressiveness along our border areas last year is resolved, we will not be able to restore our relationship to the levels that were there before COVID or before 2020.
Now, coming to the summit that you mentioned with the US President that Prime Minister Modi had, and of course the Quad meeting. Just before the Quad meeting, the AUKUS was formed, the military pact between Australia, United Kingdom, and the US. Now, has AUKUS in some senses taken the thunder away from Quad? Quad was seen to contain China, particularly on the security front. Has that agenda gone? Is Quad just another talking shop now?
Well, let's start with Quad. And Quad, I think, has a very serious agenda. The agenda really is to fulfill what we see is our vision, a collective vision between the 4 states involved, like-minded states, of a free, open, inclusive, transparent, prosperous Indo-Pacific region. The sort of region that we live in, we want to live in, and we want to see in the future. And to that end, I think the Quad leadership has had 2 summits so far. The first was a virtual one in March, and the second one was recently in DC, which you mentioned. In both of these, you would see that there's an array of initiatives that have been taken that would further the objective of an Indo-Pacific region that we would like to see. In other words, whether you talk about the vaccine initiative to manufacture vaccines in India with financing from the US and Japan, last mile support from Australia, and have this disseminated in the Indo-Pacific region, I think is an important, very, very important cooperative effort at a time when many of the countries in the Indo-Pacific are reeling from the effects of COVID. Many of these countries don't have access to affordable quality vaccines. And this is something that is, I think, making that, we've already announced that we have a certain quantity of vaccines available that are going to go out. But by the end of 2022, we expect 1 billion vaccines to be available. We've got a sort of a compact on new and critical technologies, which is very important. Semiconductors, reliable, sustainable supply chains is part of that. We're talking about climate change actions, green hydrogen, green shipping corridors, the Quad countries coming together to promote those efforts. We're talking about HADR efforts, which is something which is a collaborative effort with the Indo-Pacific countries, with the ASEAN at the centrality of this process. We see many of our friends and partners in the Indo-Pacific increasingly interested in working with the Quad on some of its activities. In other words, this is a cooperative approach. We want to co-opt and get the cooperation of countries in the Indo-Pacific. We are not getting them into another major, I would say, great game that involves their region. What we are saying is let's work together on the areas that you value, on the areas that are important. Connectivity, infrastructure development, building better infrastructure. These are areas that the Quad is working on.
And how does India look? Sorry, yeah, please finish.
Sorry. AUKUS is different.
Yes, I was going to ask you that. What is your view about AUKUS?
Is a security alliance between 3 countries that already have a security pact between them. All of these 3 countries, of course, are the countries with whom we have good relations. So I would say that AUKUS is a very different construct than Quad. AUKUS is looking at it from a purely security perspective. Quad is a group of countries that is looking at cooperative measures on the Indo-Pacific. They may be a complementarity at some level, but they're actually very different from many senses, other than the fact that they have some common membership.
Europe and France were pretty upset, France particularly, on the way US went about announcing the AUKUS. Did we get a heads up from the US about the AUKUS, that this was going to, after all, we were going to have a Quad meeting? Was India told? Aren't we a little upset by the way America just formed this alliance out of the blue?
I think, the fact that the Prime Minister spoke to the Prime Minister of Australia, or rather the Prime Minister of Australia initiated a call with our Prime Minister. The President of France spoke to our Prime Minister. Prime Minister, of course, met President Biden. We've had conversations with all of our friends and partners. It is not in our interest or anybody's interest to see a difference of views between partners in the Indo-Pacific region. We need to work together in a cooperative and collaborative manner. To that extent, I think we have to whatever extent possible, we have succeeded in narrowing down the differences, in being of some ability to help the 3 countries understand the larger perspective to work together. I'm not saying that the countries are not speaking to themselves. Obviously, these countries have very strong links. They're very close partners. But in the heat of that moment, we happen to be there both in the Quad as well as in terms of conversations that the PM has had with President Macron. And as a close friend, as a country that values its relationship with all of these countries involved, we've tried to contribute to bringing them together.
But did we get a heads up from the US? Did we tell them, hey, we're supposed to be friends, how could you do this to us?
Well, let's just say that we have fairly close information sharing arrangements, whether it's with Australia, whether it's with France, whether it's the United States, and I think those arrangements hold good.
And we didn't get there.
Look, let me just put it this way. There are many things that are above my pay grade. So I may not be able to exactly respond to what you're saying.
We've got 2 minutes, and I want you to mention vaccines earlier, right? I'm not going to pin you down on that. I understand. But what is the role India is playing, looking ahead? We had to stop Mission Maitri for various internal reasons. How do you see the future projecting itself in terms of the way India should be handling the COVID crisis internationally? There's issues of vaccine equity that India feels very strongly about. What can we contribute to the global good on that?
Let me try and put it in a construct. When we had the COVID crisis that initially hit us, we were still trying to grapple with what it meant, but it was obviously a serious issue. the Prime Minister took two initiatives, you'd recall. One was the regional initiative and one was the global initiative. The regional initiative was bringing together all the SAARC leaders in a single platform, a virtual platform, of course, to deal with what should be regional cooperation on COVID. If you look at the fact that not all of our neighbors were very much on board on issues that involve SAARC, I think it was a major initiative. And at the end of the day, you brought them together on a humanitarian initiative. We had the SAARC Emergency Response Fund that was created as a result. It was instrumental in allowing SAARC countries to cooperate with each other on areas that involved expertise, best practices, healthcare, dealing with COVID. The Prime Minister also made the suggestion that the G20 should meet to deal with the COVID crisis. And Saudi Arabia, which was the chair of the G20, convened an extraordinary meeting with the G20. And for the first time, as the Prime Minister noted in his address to the G20 had never met on a humanitarian issue. They've always met on either a financial or an economic issue. The Prime Minister mentioned the concept of human-centric globalization. This is the first time this term was used. And that has been our approach all through, whether it is in the allowing the export of essential medicines like hydroxychloroquine, whether it's allowing a certain quantity of vaccines to go out to our neighbors and others, whether it is in assisting countries in our region directly through rapid response teams. This has been the fulcrum of our approach. You help others when you can. When we had our second wave, a number of countries came together to help us, saying that, look, you helped us in the first wave. It is our responsibility to pitch in and provide solidarity with India at a difficult time. And you saw that we had a great deal of support from across the world. No sooner had the numbers come down, we found that our production of items like remdesivir, liquid medical oxygen had really been ramped up. We were able to assist Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. So what I'm saying is that it's an interdependent world. COVID has brought home to us the fact that we live not in isolation, but in a certain interlinked and interdependent world. The larger global good is a very important part of that approach. And I think that has been our foreign policy approach, that we are looking at a human-centric globalization. Vaccines is a part of that. When we had the vaccines, we did share them. We had the second wave. We needed to focus on the welfare and well-being of our own citizens. Today, we are almost ready to pass the 1 billion vaccine mark, which is a real record in any way. The other day, when we had a conversation with Australia, it turned out that we were able to vaccinate as many people as the entire population of Australia in a single day.
Let's
25 million vaccines.
For that.
So an incredible achievement by all means, that India, which had a relatively late start, is today at a 1 billion point. 70% of our population received the first dose of vaccines. Today, we have announced, the Prime Minister announced that we are ready to begin exports of vaccines. We are willing to look at our friends and partners across the world to see how we can assist them, obviously calibrated on our own requirements. So this is something that I think the world expects us to step up to the plate as the pharmacists of the world, as the manufacturing center of the world, as the healthcare center of the world, come forward, assist countries, developing countries, Africa has had such a small share of the vaccines. So we need to do what we can, and we will do what we can, contingent, of course, on our own requirements and the availability of surplus vaccines.
Well, Foreign Secretary, on that positive note, we'll have to sign off. We've run out of time, but thank you very, very much for this very insightful chat. You've been candid. Let's give him a very warm round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raj.
With that applause, may I please call upon stage Mr. Shantanu Dhar, Chief Human Resource Officer, Hindustan Power, to come up on stage and present a small token of our appreciation to our panelists. Thank you, Mr. Shringla.